February 8, 1945. 5 a.m. The German-Dutch border, east of Nijmegen, before a single Allied soldier moved that morning, more than 1,000 Allied guns opened fire at once. Over the next few hours, they would put down roughly 500,000 shells onto a strip of German-held forest and farmland barely a few miles wide. One of the heaviest concentrations of artillery fire the Western Front had seen in the entire war. It wasn't aimed at Berlin. It wasn't aimed at the Ruhr. It was aimed at clearing a patch of woodland called the Reichswald, and the force standing behind that barrage, waiting to walk into what remained, was the 1st Canadian Army. Here's the number that should stop you. By this point in the war, German High Command had roughly 90,000 troops and over 1,000 guns and mortars concentrated specifically to hold this 130-mile stretch of ground against the Canadians and the British Etzigeant Corps attached to them. That's not a token defense. That's not, we'll station some tired reservists there and focus our real strength elsewhere. That is a deliberate resource decision by a German army that by February 1945 was running desperately short of everything: fuel, men, replacements, to put real weight against this specific army on this specific stretch of the Rhine's approach, which raises the question this video is actually about. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing on every front. The Red Army was less than 100 miles from Berlin. American forces had crossed into Germany from the south, and yet, facing the 1st Canadian Army specifically, the Wehrmacht chose to dig in along the Rhine's western approaches with some of the toughest formations it had left, including the veteran 6th Parachute Division, who had already fought the Allies at Normandy and the Ardennes and knew exactly what they were up against. This wasn't a German army resigned to losing quietly. This was a German army making a very specific, very expensive bet that if there was one place worth spending its dwindling strength to hold, it was here, against them. Before we get into why, I want to ask you something, because this channel only works if the people watching are actually invested in getting this right. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. If your grandfather or great-uncle wore a Canadian uniform anywhere between Normandy and the Rhine, I want to hear it, because a lot of what follows in this story isn't taught outside of Canada, and it deserves to be. Now, back to that forest, the 1st Canadian Army wasn't actually all Canadian. That's one of the first things people get wrong. Under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, it was a genuinely international force by 1945. Canadian infantry and armoured divisions formed its corps, but it also commanded British 2nd Corps, the 1st Polish Armoured Division, and at various points Belgian, Dutch, and American units fought. But the Canadian formations were the ones the Germans had been tracking, unit by unit, since the summer of 1944. Because by the time this army reached the Rhine, it had already fought through some of the ugliest, costly ground of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. And German commanders knew exactly what these divisions had already proven they were willing to pay to win. That reputation didn't start at the Reichswald. It started 5 months earlier, in the flooded polders of the Scheldt estuary, where the Canadians had been handed a job most Allied planners considered close to impossible: dig nearly 90 well-entrenched German troops out of the mud, the dikes, and the flooded islands guarding the approach to the port of Antwerp. Europe's most valuable harbour, and the one piece of infrastructure the entire Allied advance actually needed to keep moving. It took 5 weeks. It cost the Canadians and their allies close to 13,000 casualties. And when it was finally over, on November 8, 1944, the Germans had lost the Scheldt, lost over 41,000 men as prisoners, and lost something else that's harder to put a number on. Any illusion that this particular army could be worn down cheaply. By the time German planners were deciding, in the freezing weeks of January and February 1945, exactly where to spend their last strong reserves. The Reichswald, against the Canadians, is where they chose to spend them. That decision is the real story here. And to understand it, you have to go back further than the Rhine, back to a summer battlefield outside a French city called Caen, where German officers first started writing down, in their own official reports, exactly what kind of army they were now up against. June 7, 1944. one day after D-Day. The villages of Orthy and Baronne outside Cannes, France. The Canadians who came ashore at Juno Beach the day before had pushed further inland by nightfall on June 6 than any other Allied force on any of the 5 invasion beaches. More than 7 miles, deeper than the British at Gold and Sword, deeper than the Americans at Utah and Omaha. It's one of the least told facts of D-Day itself. But it's what happened the next morning, when the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division ran head-on into a German division that had never lost a fight, that actually started building the reputation this whole story is about. The unit waiting for them was the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. On paper, this should have been a mismatch in Germany's favor. Its soldiers were mostly 17 and 18 years old, but they were commanded almost entirely by combat veterans pulled from the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, men who had already survived years of the worst warfare in human history. Leading their spearhead regiment was SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, a decorated, ruthless commander already known within the German army as one of its most effective battlefield tacticians. At Orthy and Baronne on June 7, 1944, Meyer's regiment hit the advancing Canadians hard, inflicting roughly 300 casualties on the Regina Rifles and North Nova Scotia Highlanders, and knocking out 15 Canadian tanks in a single day of fighting. I need to tell you something here that isn't easy to say, but it's essential to the true story, and it's the reason a court eventually convicted Kurt Meyer of war crimes. In the days following that fighting, between June 7 and June 17, 1944, soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division murdered approximately 156 Canadian prisoners of war and 2 British prisoners, men who had already surrendered, executed at the Abbey d'Ardennes and at other locations behind German lines. This is one of the most documented war crimes of the entire Normandy campaign, confirmed by post-war tribunals, and it's part of this story, whether it's comfortable to include or not. History doesn't get to be tidy just because it's inconvenient. What matters for understanding why the Germans came to respect this army isn't that atrocity. It's what didn't happen afterward. The Canadian divisions that had just lost men to those executions didn't break, didn't fall back, and didn't stop attacking. They kept pushing on Caen for the next 6 weeks, through some of the costliest, most grinding fighting of the entire Normandy campaign. On July 4–5, 1944, in an assault known as Operation Windsor, Canadian infantry and armour took the fiercely defended airfield at Carpiquet from Meyer's own division, absorbing 377 casualties and knocking out 17 tanks to do it. 3 weeks later, on July 25, 1944, at a place called Verrières Ridge, a battle Canadian veterans still call Black Sunday. Canadian units took roughly 1,500 casualties, including 450 killed or wounded from a single regiment, the Black Watch, in one afternoon assault against dug-in SS positions by the time the Falaise Gap closed in mid-August 1944, sealing nearly 400,000 German troops in a collapsing pocket. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the same formation that had savaged the Canadians at Orthy and murdered their prisoners in June, had been reduced to a shell of itself. Roughly 30% of its men were dead, and another 40% wounded, captured, or missing. The division that had entered Normandy as one of the most feared formations in the entire Wehrmacht ended the campaign broken by the same army it had underestimated on its first morning of contact. That is the pattern German commanders were watching build, battle after battle, for 2 months straight, an army they had hit as hard as they knew how to hit anyone, that had lost men to outright war crimes, and that simply would not stop coming. Not through recklessness, through a documented, repeated willingness to take heavily defended ground at direct cost, objective by objective, until the position collapsed. By the autumn of 1944, that reputation followed the 1st Canadian Army into the flooded polders of the Schelde estuary, where it would be tested again against nearly 90 entrenched German defenders guarding the one port the entire Allied war effort actually needed. And by February 1945, when German planners sat down to decide exactly where, along hundreds of miles of front, to spend their last strong reserves in defense of the Rhine, the record already sitting on their desks told them precisely which Allied army they could least afford to face lightly, February 8 to March 10, 1945. The Reichswald Forest and the Hochwald Gap, Western Germany. Operation Veritable began at 10:30 that first morning. 5 infantry divisions and roughly 500 tanks moving into ground the Germans had spent months turning into a fortress. 3 separate defensive lines stacked 6 miles deep, anchored on the northern end of the Siegfried Line itself. And almost immediately, the Germans did something that told the Allied command exactly how seriously they intended to fight for this ground. On February 9, 1945, they deliberately opened the floodgates on the Roer River, deliberately drowning the valley the American Ninth Army needed to cross to support the attack from the south. It delayed the American pincer for nearly 2 weeks, for it meant the 1st Canadian Army and British Essex Corps would have to fight through the Reichswald almost entirely alone, against a defense the Germans had just bought themselves extra time to reinforce. They used that time. Under General Alfred Schlemm, German command fed the veteran 6th Parachute Division and elements of Panzer Lehr into the forest, along with roughly 90,000 troops and over 1,000 guns and mortars. Men and equipment that, by February 1945, Germany genuinely could not spare on any front. Every soldier and every shell committed to holding this stretch of the Rhine was one that wasn't defending against the Soviets closing in on the east, or the Americans pushing from the south. That is what a real fear looks like on a military balance sheet. Not a quote in a diary, but a resource allocation decision so costly it weakened the entire collapsing German position just to slow down one army. It didn't work. The fighting through the Reichswald was brutal and slow. Mud, flooded ground, and a German defense that, true to form, fell back to successively tougher lines rather than breaking outright. Cleve and Goch were both leveled by bombing before Allied troops even entered them. By February 22nd, with the forest largely cleared, the offensive rolled into its second phase, Operation Blockbuster, and the fighting only got harder. The Hochwald Gap became one of the most costly close-quarters tank and infantry battles fought by Canadian troops in the entire war. A narrow strip of high ground the Germans defended with everything they had left in the sector. It took until March 10, 1945, roughly 5 weeks after the operation began, for the 1st Canadian Army to finally clear the west bank of the Rhine in this sector entirely. The final cost tells you everything about how seriously both sides treated this fight. Allied casualties across Operations Veritable and Blockbuster ran to roughly 15,600 men. German losses, by the Canadian First Army's own estimate, ran significantly higher. Over 44,000 killed, wounded, and captured, including entire divisions effectively destroyed as fighting forces on the western bank before they could even retreat across the river. Germany had committed some of its last strong reserves to hold this ground, and in 5 weeks, it lost them. So here's the answer to the question this whole story has been building toward. Why did the German army defend the Rhine, but specifically fear the Canadian First Army? Because by February 1945, German command had a complete paper trail on exactly what this force was capable of paying to win a fight it had decided mattered. From the first murderous morning outside Caen in June 1944, through 6 weeks of brutal attrition that broke one of the Wehrmacht's most feared SS divisions, through 5 muddy weeks clearing 90, found entrenched German defenders out of the Scheldt to open a port the entire Allied war effort depended on. Every one of those campaigns ended the same way. The Germans inflicted real, serious cost, and the Canadians took the ground anyway. By the time this army reached the edge of the Rhine, German commanders weren't guessing what would happen if they dug in lightly. They already knew, so they dug in with everything they had left. And it still wasn't enough. 6 weeks after the Rhineland fighting ended, the war in Europe was over. Many of the men who fought through the Reichswald and the Hochwald Gap in the freezing February mud of 1945 came home to towns across Canada that most people watching this video have never heard of. And a lot of them never talked about what they'd done there. If that's part of your own family's history, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. This channel exists to dig up exactly these stories, the ones with real dates, real units, and real cost behind them. So if that's what you came here for, there's more of it coming.